Let's talk about bigotry today. I want to cover anti-Semitism. I want to cover colloquial racism. And I want to start by talking about the Masonic Temple. So, the Masonic Temple, or the anti-Masonics, were developed out of a particular misunderstanding. So I'm going to go back to the days when the Masonic Temple was a fraternity for stonemasons. So the Stonemasons Guild, which was basically a Masonic Temple, in order to become a master stonemason, it was shrouded in mystery. What's the requirement to become a master mason? And what's the requirement to do this type of work? So because the Masons were trying to protect their own jobs, there were things that they didn't let get out into the public. Specifically, how do you set a keystone on an arched doorway? That was the beginning of the conspiracy theory. There were certain things that you just weren't allowed to know until you became a master mason. And because there was so much stonework happening at the time, due primarily to the church, the societies around where all of this work was happening, they just couldn't make heads or tails. The Masons did a wonderful job at keeping that keystone method secret. So now everybody hates the Masons. I want to use this to jump in and show us how we became anti-Semitic and how our actions lead to racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, etc., 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 etc. I think keeping that story in mind is a good place to start. When we want to talk about anti-Semitism as a behavior, the Hebrew people, the Hebrew diaspora, and make no mistake, by the time anti-Semitism was beginning, the Hebrew people were a diaspora, i.e., a displaced population. Yes, the tribe of Abraham started in what is now the Holy Land, modern-day Israel. But they were still nomadic people. And they collected the skills they needed to survive as nomadic people. So they had a wide variety of skills. They could be a compact, independent unit. So wherever they traveled to, they didn't need the greater community around them to support them. They could support themselves within that community without the help of the outside community. And of course, this created suspicion. Over time, that suspicion would compound because all of the local communities that they traveled through would share stories of how this independent group doesn't need our help, etc., etc. The result of that was that independent group, the Hebrew diaspora, remained a mystery to the communities that surrounded it. And as they would travel through those communities and go to the next communities, the mystery would follow with them. There was no attempt by those communities to actually learn who this Hebrew diaspora was, what they were about, what they were doing. Fast forward, after Emperor Constantine and the Roman Empire bows down to the Catholic Church. In the Catholic Church, the practice of usury or loaning money was forbidden. The Hebrew diaspora was outside the Catholic Church, so they could loan money. Because they had this wealth of skills within their diaspora, they were able to generate just enough revenue to keep their head above water. Now, come the time. In order to reclaim the Holy Land for the Christian faith, the governments that buy into the Catholic Empire have to raise armies. Raising armies costs money. Where do you go to raise that money? Your system is feudal. There really isn't anyone in your system that can give you that money. The feudal lords can't persuade their serf population to join that army. So how do you do it? You pay the soldiers. But you can't pay the soldiers with money you don't have. So that money was initially provided by the Jewish diaspora, with the understanding that the Jewish diaspora would receive that money back. During this period, the fiefdoms in the Holy Roman Empire made it a practice to default on their loans. And of course, you go into fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, shame on you. I'm sorry, other way around. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. So this Jewish diaspora begins to realize the expectation is that we're going to loan out this money. And the Jewish diaspora has the expectation of the Holy Roman Empire that this money is never getting paid back. So they're of the understanding that the empire will never make good on the loan. In other words, the expectation from the diaspora is that the fiefdom borrowing the money to raise an army has no intention of paying them back. That expectation actually held true some 90-odd% of the time. What they did was very clever. They began investing in their own businesses. They had the skills. They had their own smiths. They had their own tailors. So their own businesses now are generating money from these communities that they're tied to now because they have money tied up in the government in those communities. That money, which the government has no intention of ever paying back, so they're investing in their own businesses. Now, those businesses in turn generate revenue, and then the other local lords under those fiefdoms become a mercantile class. They begin selling their own goods outside of their local community to this Jewish diaspora, in which, instead of loaning money to them, because the Jewish diaspora realizes this local lord doesn't have an army. The army is currently tied up by the Holy Roman Empire to go to the Holy Land to capture Jerusalem for the Christian church. So what they do is they make a deal in return. X amount of profit, in turn we loan you the money for your business to operate. And they invest in those local community businesses. That ties them down to that community now. But the other thing it does is it generates revenue for them. Here's where the problem exists for the Jewish diaspora. When it comes time to pay back the loan, and the Holy Roman Empire says, no, we're going to default, and there's nothing you can do about it, the Jewish diaspora gets to say, okay, that's fine. They don't need the Holy Roman Empire to pay back the money. They have revenue being generated by the local community. They have revenue being generated by their own internal businesses. The other things the Jewish diaspora did, which was very clever, and more likely than not, it came out of a need for survival. They couldn't survive without it. If they had to do trade, they traded within their own community. So whatever revenue they were generating was coming back into the Jewish diaspora. This allowed them to continue to grow without assistance from the Holy Roman Empire, which every other fiefdom in the region required the Holy Roman Empire to grow, except the Jewish diaspora. Now, of course, all the lower level serfs, they're working themselves to death for their local lord, who's not making money. He's actually giving roughly half of his earnings to the Jewish diaspora. And now you have this thing. You have this idea of, oh, they can't be trusted. They were able to circumvent the crown. Which, if you actually spent 5 seconds thinking about it, you would have known how to circumvent the crown. That developed this mistrust that would only grow. It would never shrink. The European community as a whole just didn't have the wherewithal or the capability to think in terms of, oh, they're doing these preventive actions, which is countering everything that we're doing to hurt them. It never dawned on the Europeans that that was actually what was happening. And now you have full-blown anti-Semitism. Let's move forward. And I want to look specifically at the United States at around 1910 to 1930. So you have these communities. They build themselves up. In the South, you have resentment over the Civil War. In the North, you have this large population of white European settlers that are indoctrinated in the Puritan belief. And it's important to note that because the Puritan belief is fundamentally wicked. The Puritan structure was, if you're not a Puritan, you're not a human being. That was their philosophy. And it carries over into today. So you look at evangelical Christians, they're very much like that. Be very careful with my statement. I have no intent of accusing every single evangelical Christian of being like this. But you look at the loudest evangelical Christians, they actually are like this. If you're not an evangelical Christian, you're not a human being. And with all of their denials, people like me, we get to point at their behavior and say, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? That idea that everyone else is less, that relates back to the Puritans themselves. They demanded help from those indigenous Native American populations. They never offered anything in return. They pretended to trade. In a very real sense, looking at wampum, the Europeans were counterfeiting. The wampum had deep spiritual meaning for those indigenous tribes in the northeastern U.S. It doesn't take much to farm those shellfish, which are used to create the wampum. Not for Europeans, because the Europeans had no sense of moderation. The Europeans weren't thinking about what's going to happen 2 years from now. In fact, they weren't thinking about what was going to happen tomorrow, let alone what was going to happen in 100 years when all these shellfish would disappear because of overfarming. The North American Indians, the indigenous North Americans, they actually had that within their philosophy. Their spiritual beliefs were such that the primary overarching idea was to live in harmony with your environment. because the Europeans came from an Ice Age culture, if you will. Not entirely true, but true enough. The European structure, the European government structure, the European social structure began developing at the near end of the Ice Age and moved over. And they just never changed after that, which meant that the Europeans had to become competent at modifying their environment. And they brought that with them. So when you had the successful North American colony, which was in Massachusetts, you had the Puritan colonies that pretty much pervaded the colonized American social order. And it did a great deal of damage to the cultures that were already here, because they didn't believe in getting along with your neighbor. Their idea was, we want these natural resources, and if you have them, we can't have them. So we're going to take them by force. And because the Europeans had rifles, they were able to do that pretty easily. In the end, I think the Native Americans won because they're still here. In spite of all of the efforts for the next 2 centuries to wipe them out, they still exist. And gratefully, as I understand, I no longer live near indigenous cultures. They're making a comeback in a big way, which I think is wonderful. When I lived in New Mexico out by the Pueblo, those people were capable of just moving mountains. They were among the best people to work with I'd ever seen. Hardworking, creative, innovative, wicked bright. Not a lot of formal schooling, but God, did they know what they were doing. A lot better than most of the white people that I worked with. Again, I want to make it clear, I'm not just slamming. There are reasons. So looking at the African diaspora, or in modern day terms, the former North American, African American slave population. They have these communities that they've built. They're trying to build these communities up. And then comes redlining. The idea was to disperse the population from the East Coast. The East Coast just had way too much population in order for the population to sustain itself there. They had to get people to move out west. But when they wrote the laws, in order to get those laws through Congress, you couldn't loan money to the slave diaspora. You couldn't give federal grants to the slave diaspora. If they didn't build it on their own, they couldn't have it. But those white settlers that were coming from back east, they had the land grants. So the homestead was only for white people. You couldn't homestead if you were African American diaspora. Which meant that you couldn't get the land grants, which meant that you couldn't buy property. You couldn't get a loan. The law refused banks the ability to loan money to that African American diaspora. And as we're moving out west, this changes, but only slightly. Not very much. You'll notice the settler population was more tolerant than the population back east. And that's because of necessity. In the urban environments, they didn't have the challenges that they had in those rural environments out west. You had to get along with your neighbors. Your neighbors helped you wrangle your cattle. Your neighbors helped you build your homestead. So, but the philosophy didn't change broadly enough. As a result, you get the state of Texas, where like more than half of the people in Texas think that you're not human if you immigrated from somewhere else in the universe. That being the case, we fast forward even more, we get into the 1950s. It's okay to destroy those African American diaspora communities. It's perfectly acceptable. Socially, they have a hard time getting a job because we're allowed to not give them an opportunity. So, by social structure, we refuse them opportunities for income. We refuse them opportunities to build their own businesses. We refuse them opportunities to generate revenue. This causes a very unique circumstance to happen. The only revenue generating vehicle they have open to them is crime. It's the only business they can get into where we as a society are going to say, no, you can't do that, regardless of what we're saying to the rest of society. As a result, you have a large criminal population in the African American diaspora. That allows law enforcement to view them all as criminals, which perpetuates the problem that we created in the first place. So now, I'm walking this through, that secret that the Masons kept to themselves, which, hey, you know, every union does the same thing. These are skills that you can only have when you get to this level. The reason for that is you have to have so much experience to execute these skills successfully. But it's all mysterious. It's stuff that I can't understand. They're being secretive. I don't like that. They're excluding me from their activities. It makes no difference that I really don't want to participate in their activities. That never occurs to me. I'm being forcibly excluded. No, you're not. At any time you can learn how to be a stonemason and go through this process yourself. Looking at the Jewish diaspora. How are they making money? How are they able to beat the fact that we have no intention of paying back the loan that we borrowed? Well, if you're not going to pay the loan back that you borrowed, I'll invest in your businesses and I'll get the money back that way through the profits from your business. It's clever thinking. It's a good way to look at it. And additionally, my entire community invests primarily in my community. Makes sense. It's a good way to do things. It gets the job done. But because you're outside of it, they're doing something sketchy. They're not going broke. They should be going broke, but it's witchcraft. So it's our own ignorance that led to anti-Semitism. And then again, it was our actions with the African American diaspora that led to racism. We gave ourselves permission. We kept setting up to where you can't do this, they can't do that. We're not going to give them those opportunities. So the only opportunities they had open to them were opportunities that allowed us to commit the atrocities we committed, like the Tulsa race riots, like Emmett Till, like Selma. And let's look at the Islamophobia. I understand. I get it. The real big one, the one that started it all off, was in 1972 at the Olympics, where the Israeli Olympic team was taken hostage. Those of you who are old enough to remember it, I'm not going to go into it. At the time, I was only 2 years old. I don't know a whole lot about it. I remember all through the 80s, every time you turned around. Let's go back to 1947. In 1947, correctly so, primarily the U.S., the United Kingdom, and France, they wanted to split up the Middle East. There was no coherent structure in the Middle East. The United Kingdom did some vicious things. Some really, really mean-spirited things in the Middle East. They made a deal with the Shiite tribes in return for help during the 2 world wars that they reneged on at the end of the Second World War. And because King Fahd was willing to sell them oil for less money than the Wallad tribe, they reneged with their agreement on the Wallab tribe. They violated it. And they made a deal with King Fahd instead, fomenting modern-day Saudi Arabia. But in 1947, they established the State of Israel, which should have been done. You needed a place where the Jewish diaspora, which has been shattered across Europe because of the Second World War, could go, be safe, and thrive. They decided they were going to do it in Palestine because there was a lot of empty space in Palestine. But they made 2 major mistakes. Mistake 1 was because of the structure of the Palestinian people. Bear in mind, to this day, their primary let me try that again. Excuse me. Bear in mind, to this day, they're primarily nomadic. And all of the tribes have problems with all the other tribes. There's no one tribe you can go to and say, want to make a political agreement with you. It's easy to say I'm going to go to the largest tribe, but normally the largest tribe has the most enemies, which means that whatever their negotiating position is, the majority of Palestinians are not going to be on board. So they made no attempt to find out which tribe was going to give them the best negotiating position. That was mistake number 1. Mistake number 2. Because of the United Kingdom's philosophy, we have the most money in the world, and therefore we get to keep it all. Nobody can tell us anything because we're the wealthiest, which wasn't true. At the end of the Second World War, the U.S. was the wealthiest. Nonetheless, the United Kingdom made specific demands of Palestine that none of the Palestinian tribes were willing to acquiesce to. None of them were going to agree with those commands. When the United Kingdom said, well, you know what? We have the army, we have the military might, we have the financial might to guarantee this happens. The Palestinians took the only option they had open to them. They walked away. They left the table. And in their position, I would have done the same thing. So would you, so would everybody else. It was the right thing for the Palestinians to do. The problem is that nobody made an attempt to go back to the Palestinians and get them back to the table. Nobody even tried. And that was 1947. Now Israel exists. And of course, everybody in the region resents it. Because quite literally, Israel exists on stolen land. And it's really, really easy to say, well, it's their land now. The Palestinians don't have a right to it. But my family has owned that land for thousands of years. I'm the 150th generation to live in this spot. I don't care what you think about the Palestinians. If you trade places, you're going to think exactly the same thing. This is my farm. This is my home. You don't get to take it from me. And now we have the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which realistically started in 1947. All of us love to say, it goes back way further than that. It was the Holy Wars. It was this. It was that. It was the other thing. The Holy Wars was the Roman Empire trying to take Jerusalem away from the Ottoman Turks. Surprisingly, it had very little to do with the Jewish or the Arabs. The Arabs, of course, aligned with the Ottoman Turks. Makes sense. 95% of the Arab trade was with the Ottoman Turks. Why wouldn't they align with the Ottoman Turks? Their cultures are intertwined. Their philosophies are the same. They do things the same way. The Jewish diaspora, they aligned with Christians. They aligned with the Ottomans, depending on where they were. The group that was in the Holy Land, that tribe of Abraham, that tribe of Jacob, they were unaligned. They were neutral throughout the entire Crusades, for the most part. So, those conflicts that we like to attribute to the fight between Ishmael and Isaac, in the Eastern mythos, they don't have the weight that they have here. And much of the Eastern mythos sympathizes with Ishmael. The entire Western ethos, forgive me, I shouldn't make an overarching claim like that. The majority of the Western ethos sympathizes with Isaac, because Ishmael was a bastard son. And in the feudal system, the bastard child has no claim to the throne. So, here we are. Fast forward even more. We finally get a peace deal in the 1990s. President Bill Clinton negotiates a peace deal between Yasser Arafat and Benjamin Netanyahu. We have a two-state solution. It was a bad deal. It was a bad deal from the beginning. It was doomed to fail. And if you would have spent 5 seconds thinking about it, you know exactly why it failed. Because we were so worried about Israeli security, Israel had control of everything going in and out of Palestine. So Palestine, which we split, we had the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. It's being starved to death. It only has enough power for about 6 hours a day, and this is from the 1990s. It only has enough electrical power to run 6 hours a day. None of the goods that are produced in Palestine are shipped out of Palestine because Israeli companies get the first crack. And going back to 1947, the Israeli government was set up as an apartheid government. Here in the United States, we love to say they're a democracy. They're not. You look at the Israeli government, and you look at the South African government, and you switch black with Palestinian, they're the exact same government. So what do? You don't understand why the Palestinian people hate the Israelis? I can easily understand why the Israelis hate the Palestinians. For all those Palestinians that shout, oh, Israel doesn't have a right to exist. Hey, Israel exists. That mere fact that they exist guarantees them the right to exist. At the same time, Israel gives no quarter to the Palestinians. It doesn't matter how legitimate a Palestinian's claim is, Israel doesn't recognize it. And they've done that forever, from the time that Israel was established in 1947. I don't blame Israel. I don't blame the Palestinians. I blame the United Kingdom. They fucked Israel over so hard. I'm sorry. They fucked the Palestinians over so hard that the Palestinians would never recover. And quite frankly, that was their intent. At that particular time, oil was the driver of industry. And they wanted to get oil for free. In order to get oil for free, they had to guarantee that the Middle East was unstable. They did it intentionally, they did it with malice, and they did it in a particular cruelty that you look at Donald Trump, you understand exactly where he came from. And for those of you who think that I'm being overly judgmental, you had the entire Caribbean protectorates that after the Second World War went to the United Kingdom to rebuild the United Kingdom. And as recently as Theresa May, those people had not been granted citizenship to the United Kingdom. They reconstructed the United Kingdom. But they weren't worthy of being citizens of the United Kingdom. The reason the United Kingdom didn't have famine during the late stage of the Second World War is because India had the famine. The United Kingdom took all of the food out of India to feed the United Kingdom, which forced both modern-day Pakistan and modern-day India to starve. Churchill's objective was to kill off the bot. They're not British. They don't have a right to exist. All right. Explains the political problems you have later. Why so many countries in the Middle East were friendlier with the Soviet Union than they were with the Western cultures? Because the European cultures kept fucking them over. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. If I understand that the United Kingdom, the United States, is going to fuck me over and renege on any agreement that they make with me, why should I make an agreement with them? But here we are. I don't know if this understanding will do anything to reduce racism, anti-Semitism, or Islamophobia, or any of the other prejudices that we carry with us. I don't know if being able to convey this understanding does. However, I do know that when I feel like I'm being unreasonable. In other words, when I feel like I'm behaving in a manner that's racist, this understanding helps me look at my actions and say, am I the one in the wrong here? Am I the bad guy? Sometimes it forces me to change my behavior. In the interest of full disclosure, it doesn't always force me to change my behavior. But sometimes, often enough to where I notice it, it makes me look at my behavior and say, am I the one in the wrong? And I hope that if you take this understanding that I'm offering, you'll be able to do the same thing. And I hope a consequence of that is we have less racism. We have less anti-Semitism. We have less Islamophobia. We have less other people are less. All right, it's time to watch the news. Have a wonderful night. Try to get out and enjoy the weather. I know here in the Midwest, it's beautiful. Be well.